Well, hello there, and thank you for joining me for another broadcast of God's podcast. I'm your host. God is gracious. My subject today, He must become greater, I must become less. This comes from John chapter 3, verse 30, which reads, He must become greater, I must become less. Consider what a powerful and countercultural statement this is. John the Baptist has enjoyed a popular ministry, but now Christ has come. And some of John's disciples are getting a little jealous that some of their followers seem to be leaving and going to Jesus. John states that this is exactly what should be happening. How much more powerful and effective would the Church of Jesus Christ be today if this were the attitudes of all ministers? Pride and selfish ambition are cancers in the church. Sorry about that. Everywhere that the gospel is well represented, there rises up factions and competition for the wandering sheep. So again, everywhere that the gospel is well represented, there rises up factions and competitions for the wandering sheep who are taught to pick a church body by the same consumer standards that they use to pick a restaurant. Satan is having his way in the church in this area, but we should take heart. This happens this happened from the very beginning. And God is still in charge of it all. In Paul's day, he had to state that it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but he also said the following verse, Philippians 1:8. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether for false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice, says Paul. But be that as it may, if you are able, repent and root out all selfish ambition in ministry for your own sake and for the sake of the glory of Christ and the good of his church. So let's take a quick look at the two key parts of John 3:30. Number one, he must become greater. John is not saying that Christ in himself is not already as great intrinsically as he could possibly be. Rather, he refers to the fame and influence of Christ. John's desire and the reason he existed was to see Christ exalted and glorified, rather than be anxious that his followers were leaving him for Christ, which was the disposition of his remaining disciples. John was glad. Again, number one, he must be greater. Number two, and the final part of this small verse, number two, I must become less. No doubt some of John's disciples showed the tendency of all men to hitch their stars to a great man for the sake of being great by association. But Christ is the head of man, just as God is the head of Christ. Our allegiance should be to Christ alone. While the Bible teaches us to follow leaders, there should be no one between us and Christ. All Christian ministers does well to get out of the way of Jesus, and all ministers will be tempted to do the opposite. This usually takes the form of a kind of self-importance that causes a leader to express to himself and others that he carries such a heavy burden, when in reality he has taken on Christ's burden as a way to justify his own existence, planning ministries that are extensions of their egos rather than the church that Christ promised to build. So again, this has been a brief look at John 3:30, which reads, he must be greater, I must become less. He must become greater, Christ, I must become less, me. For the Christian who is born again, our minds are being renewed, our flesh is being crucified, and we are dying to self. So we walk with God every day through his Spirit, and every day he in me must become greater. I, the man, the earthly man, must become less. The spirit man must become greater. The fleshly man, the worldly man, must become less. So again, thank you so much for joining me for this brief broadcast of God's podcast. And until next time, you, your family members, and friends be blessed and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye now.